On the afternoon of March the 15th, 1781, a British general stood at the edge of a Carolina wood and watched the finest soldiers in his army being pulled apart in front of him. Down the slope, in a churning knot of men and horses and steel, his elite brigade of guards, troops with a century of reputation behind them, were fighting hand to hand against American infantry and cavalry, and they were losing. Not retreating, losing, being surrounded, cut off, and destroyed where they stood. He had perhaps a minute to decide what to do about it. And the decision he reached, the one that would save his army and doom his campaign in the very same breath, was to bring up his own cannon, load them with grape shot, and fire directly into the melee. Into the mass of struggling bodies where his own guardsmen were tangled together with the enemy. He knew what that meant. His second in command, bleeding from a chest wound, rode up and begged him not to give the order. The general refused. The iron went in among friend and foe alike, and it cleared the field. Think about what that took. This was Charles, Lord Cornwallis, an aggressive, gifted, deeply confident commander who had spent the previous 3 months chasing an American army across 2 states, beating it in every race, outmarching it, outlasting it, forcing it to run. He had roughly 2,000 veteran regulars under his hand, some of the best drilled infantry on earth. The man on the other side of that field, Nathaniel Greene, had never won a major battle in his life, and would not win this one either. When the sun went down, Cornwallis held the ground. He rode home and called it a victory. 7 months later, he surrendered his entire army at Yorktown. The line that runs between those 2 facts, between the man standing victorious over a Carolina cornfield and the man handing over his sword in Virginia, runs directly through this battlefield. Guilford Courthouse is where the British won and lost the American South in the same 2 hours. It is the battle that a British statesman would describe, a few weeks later, in one of the most quietly devastating sentences ever said about a triumph. And to understand how a victory could function exactly like a defeat, you have to understand that this battle was never really about the ground at all. Because battles are not always about who is left standing at the end. Sometimes they are about arithmetic. Sometimes the side that wins the field is the side that can least afford what winning costs. And no commander in this war understood that grim ledger better than the quiet, limping Rhode Island Quaker who had deliberately arranged for his own army to be beaten over and over again, until beating it became more than his enemy could survive. By the end of this video, you'll understand how an army that lost nearly every battle it fought won the war anyway. You'll see why a proud British general chose to slaughter his own elite guardsmen with cannon fire rather than lose them to the enemy. You'll follow the single cavalry charge that came within moments of destroying Cornwallis's center outright, and the desperate, cold-blooded order that stopped it. You'll learn about the strategic trap that wasn't a trench or a hill, but an entire theater of war, built out of rivers and hunger and distance. And you'll meet the men who made it happen. A giant with an enormous sword, a colonel who kept turning tactical defeats into strategic wins, and a handful of officers whose names most people have never heard, standing at the exact hinge of American history. These men were fighting over a crossroads almost nobody today could find on a map. What they decided there decided everything that came after. So before we walk onto that field, hit the subscribe button. It genuinely is the one thing that keeps work like this coming, and we're now also live on Spotify. So if you'd rather listen to these than watch them, on a commute or a long drive, you can find us there too. Now, let's step back to the winter of 1780, to a southern rebellion that had, by every reasonable measure, already collapsed. to understand why Greene fought the way he did. You have to understand how close the American cause in the South came to simply ceasing to exist. For the first years of the Revolution, the fighting had centered on the North. But by 1778, the British had settled on a new theory of the war, and on paper, it was a good one. The South, they believed, was full of loyal subjects, loyalists, Tories, who only needed the protection of the King's army to rise up and reclaim their colonies for the crown. Take the southern ports, put boots on the ground, rally the loyal population, and the rebellion would rot from the inside. It was called the Southern Strategy, and for a while, it looked unstoppable. Savannah fell in 1778. Then came the disaster. In May of 1780, an entire American army, more than 5,000 men, surrendered at Charleston. It was the single worst American defeat of the war, a catastrophe that erased the Southern Continental establishment in one stroke. And 3 months after that, at Camden, the man Congress sent to rebuild that army, Horatio Gates, led it straight into Cornwallis and was routed so completely that he personally rode something like 60 miles from the battlefield before he stopped. The militia had broken and run. The Continentals had been overrun. The Baron de Kalb lay dying of 11 wounds. In the space of a single summer, the United States had lost 2 armies in the South and had almost nothing left to replace them with. This is the situation George Washington was staring at when he reached for the one subordinate he trusted more than any other. Nathaniel Greene did not look like the answer. He was 38 years old, a foundry owner's son from Rhode Island, raised a Quaker, and then thrown out of his Quaker meeting for the crime of taking too keen an interest in soldiering. He walked with a stiff leg. He had spent much of the war not commanding troops in the field, but running the Army's supply system as quartermaster general, a thankless, unglamorous job that generals dreamed of escaping. And that, it turned out, was exactly the point. Because Greene had spent years learning the truth that most battlefield generals never fully absorb. That armies are not moved by courage. They are moved by wagons and shoes and salt and boats and the slow arithmetic of what a countryside can and cannot feed. He understood war as a logistical problem before he understood it as a tactical one. In the campaign to come, that would make all the difference. When Greene took formal command of the Southern Army in December of 1780, he sat down, looked at what he had, and reached a conclusion that would have been unthinkable to almost any European-trained general of the age. He decided that he could not win, not in the ordinary sense. Not by lining his men up across a field from Cornwallis and trading volleys until one side broke, because if he did that, his side would break every time. His troops were fewer, greener, hungrier, and worse equipped than the British regulars in front of them. A stand-up fight was a death sentence, so he chose a different kind of war. He would retreat. He would wear the enemy down. He would trade space for time and blood for exhaustion, giving ground whenever ground was cheaper than lives, striking only when the odds briefly favored him, and above all, keeping his army alive and in the field no matter how many battles it technically lost. Historians call this a Fabian strategy, after the Roman general Fabius, who bled Hannibal white by refusing to give him the decisive battle he wanted. Greene would later reduce the whole philosophy to a single sentence, in a letter that has followed his name ever since. "We fight," he wrote, "get beat, rise, and fight again." It sounds almost like a joke. It was the most dangerous idea the British would face in the entire Southern campaign. Before any of that strategy could matter, though, Greene had to solve a more immediate problem. His army was falling apart in his hands, not from British bullets, but from simple want. His letters from this period are painful to read. The men were, in his own words, practically naked, not underdressed for winter, but literally without adequate clothing, some without shoes at all, marching over frozen and half-frozen ground that cut their feet. They were short of food, short of tents, short of the ordinary equipment that lets a body of men live in the field for more than a few days at a time. Greene, the old quartermaster, threw himself at the problem with a kind of grim ingenuity. He arranged for local women to be paid in salt, actual salt, a currency more reliable than the collapsing paper money, in exchange for sewing uniforms. He authorized swapping raw beef hides for tanned leather and shoes, turning the byproducts of feeding the army into the means of shoeing it. And he understood something that connected all of it to the survival of the rebellion itself. An army that cannot be clothed and fed does not just suffer. It dissolves. Men desert, militia go home. And every man who walks away from a starving, freezing camp is also a voter, a neighbor, a piece of the fragile political will that kept the whole revolution standing. Greene wrote to Washington that the ordinary life of a soldier was hard enough, but that when you added hunger and cold and rags to it, the soldier's condition became simply intolerable. And intolerable conditions do not produce armies. They produce empty camps. Keeping his men in uniform was, in the most literal sense, keeping the war alive. Then he did something that broke every rule in the book. Facing an enemy who already outnumbered his effective force, Greene divided his army in two. On its face, this was madness. The first principle of warfare, drilled into every officer, is that you do not split a smaller force in the presence of a larger one, because the enemy can turn and destroy each piece in turn. But Greene had read Cornwallis correctly. He knew the British general was aggressive, hungry for a decisive blow, and constrained by a hostile countryside that could not easily feed a large, concentrated army. By sending a detachment far off to the west, into the South Carolina backcountry, Greene was daring Cornwallis to divide his own force to deal with it. He was turning the British commander's aggression into a lever. And Cornwallis, who wanted nothing more than to catch and crush a piece of the American army, took the bait exactly as Greene had gambled he would. The detachment Greene sent west was commanded by one of the most remarkable soldiers of the Revolution, Brigadier General Daniel Morgan, a huge, rough, self-made Virginia frontiersman, a former teamster whose back still carried the scars of a British flogging from years before. Morgan was a natural tactician who understood ordinary men, militia especially, better than any polished officer in either army. He knew their fears. He knew exactly how much he could ask of them and no more. And when Cornwallis sent his fastest, sharpest, most feared officer racing after Morgan's little command, Morgan turned and taught the British a lesson that would echo straight through to Guilford Courthouse. The man Cornwallis sent was Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, and it is impossible to overstate how much the Americans hated and feared him. Tarleton was young, brilliant, ferociously aggressive, and, in the American telling, merciless. At an earlier engagement, his men had cut down surrendering Continentals, and Tarleton's quarter had become bitter shorthand across the South for no quarter at all, for the killing of men who had thrown down their arms. He commanded a fast-moving mixed force of cavalry and light infantry, and Cornwallis turned him loose with somewhere over 1,000 men and a single instruction: run Morgan down and destroy him. Morgan chose to make his stand at a place called the Cowpens, an open, lightly wooded grazing ground in upstate South Carolina, on January the 17th, 1781. And the way he arranged his men there was a small work of genius, precisely because it was built around his soldiers' weaknesses instead of pretending they didn't exist. He knew his militia would run, Everyone knew militia ran. Untrained men with no bayonets, facing disciplined regulars and cold steel, almost always broke. So Morgan didn't ask them not to. He asked them for 2 volleys, just 2. He put his best riflemen and marksmen forward in a skirmish line, then his militia behind them, and his tough Continental regulars in a 3rd line at the back. He rode among the militia the night before, and that morning, joking, encouraging, pleading, telling them all he wanted was 2 good volleys, and then they had his permission to fall back around the left. 2 volleys, boys. Aim for the men with the epaulets, the officers. Then you can go. It worked to perfection. The skirmishers stung the advancing British and peeled away. The militia fired their 2 volleys, aimed deadly volleys that dropped a shocking number of British officers, and then withdrew, exactly as ordered. And Tarleton's men, seeing the Americans fall back, believed they were watching the usual route. They surged forward, formations loosening, discipline dissolving into the eagerness of the chase, straight into the waiting line of Continentals. Then came the moment that Morgan's whole design turned on. On the American right, an order was misheard, and a portion of the Continental line began to pull back. To the British, it looked like the final collapse. It was nothing of the kind. The American commander there, John Eager Howard, remember that name because he's about to appear again at the climax of our story, simply halted his men, had them face about, and at murderously close range unleashed a full volley into the disordered British, then sent them in with the bayonet. At the same instant, William Washington's cavalry, remember that name too, came crashing in against the British flank. In a matter of minutes, Tarleton's command didn't just break. It was annihilated. Tarleton himself barely escaped with a handful of horsemen. The rest were killed or captured almost to a man. Cowpens was one of the most complete tactical victories of the entire war, and it mattered for 2 reasons that reach far beyond that single field. The first is that it cost Cornwallis his light troops, his fastest, most flexible soldiers, the very men best suited to catching and pinning a nimble opponent, right at the moment he most needed them. The second is that the design of cowpens, the layered defense that asked each line only for what it could actually give, was about to be borrowed, scaled up, and reused on a much larger and bloodier stage. When Nathaniel Greene arranged his army at Guilford Courthouse 2 months later, he would build it around the memory of what Morgan had done here. The 3 lines. The militia asked only for a couple of volleys. The regulars held in reserve for the decisive moment. Guilford is Cowpens rewritten for a bigger, deadlier battle. And the story of how it went differently is the story of everything that could go wrong when you try to repeat a miracle. But first, Cornwallis had to catch Greene. And in trying, he would very nearly destroy his own army before the 2 forces ever fully met. The loss of Tarleton's command at Cowpens did something to Cornwallis that his enemies could not have engineered on purpose. It made him reckless. He was, by all accounts, humiliated and furious, his best striking force gone, his prestige dented, a self-taught American teamster having outfought his prize officer. And in his anger, he made a decision that historians have argued over ever since. To catch Greene and Morgan, to move fast enough to run them down before they could slip away with their prisoners and their momentum, Cornwallis burned his own baggage train. Consider what that actually meant. He put to the torch the tents his men slept under, the wagons that carried their food and spare ammunition, the rum, the extra clothing, the accumulated comfort and security of a professional army in the field. He stripped his force down to what the soldiers could carry on their backs, transforming his heavy, methodical British column into something almost as light and fast as the Americans he was chasing. It was a bold, even brilliant gamble, the kind of ruthless decision that separates aggressive commanders from cautious ones. it was also, in hindsight, the moment the campaign began to consume him. Because an army that has burned its own supplies is an army with no margin for error, no cushion against bad weather or bad luck or a countryside that won't feed it. Cornwallis had bet everything on speed, and what followed was a pursuit of some 200 miles across the width of North Carolina in the dead of a wet, freezing winter. A chase that history remembers as the Race to the Dan. It was a race defined less by fighting than by rivers. The Carolina Piedmont in February is a landscape of swollen, half-frozen watercourses, and every one of them became a potential trap or a potential salvation, depending on who reached it first and who controlled the boats. Greene, thinking like the quartermaster he had been, had planned for exactly this. He arranged in advance for boats to be positioned at the crossings, and he made sure that when his army passed over a river, the boats went with it, leaving the pursuing British stranded on the wrong bank, staring at water they had no easy way to cross. The pattern repeated again and again. At the Catawba, Cornwallis lost precious days waiting for floodwaters to drop before he could force a crossing at Cowan's Ford at the beginning of February. And even that crossing nearly turned to disaster. One of the few first-hand voices we have from the British ranks belongs to Sergeant Roger Lamb of the Royal Welch Fusiliers, whose memoirs are among the most valuable surviving accounts of the campaign. And Lamb described the Catawba as deep and rapid and murderous. He recorded a detail so strange it has the ring of truth, that the small-statured British General Charles O'Hara, a man we will meet again, bleeding at the climax of Guilford, had to be carried across the freezing torrent riding on the back of a grenadier, all while American riflemen on the far bank fired at the struggling column. The British got across, but they got across cold, wet, exhausted, and a full step behind. Greene never let them close that step. On the 2nd of February, his army crossed the flooded Yadkin in boats he had prepositioned, and once again the boats came with him. And once again, the British arrived to find only water. And finally, on the 14th of February, after weeks of this brutal, sodden marathon, Greene brought his army over the Dan River into the safety of Virginia, taking, as always, every available boat with him. Cornwallis reached the southern bank and stopped. He had no way over. The race was finished, and he had lost it. He had chased the American army the entire breadth of North Carolina and never once managed to bring it to battle. His men were ragged now, their supplies gone with the baggage he'd burned, the countryside behind them stripped bare, and the enemy sitting safe and resupplying across a river he couldn't force. Every principle of the Fabian strategy had just been demonstrated in miniature. Greene had traded a great deal of space, had refused every invitation to a stand-up fight, and had let the pursuit itself do the work of grinding his enemy down. Cornwallis had won the race in the sense that he had driven Greene out of the state. He had lost it in every sense that mattered. Unable to follow Greene into Virginia, Cornwallis fell back to Hillsborough, North Carolina, and turned to the whole theoretical foundation of the Southern strategy. If he couldn't destroy the rebel army, he would rally the loyal population instead. He raised the King's standard, issued proclamations, and called on the loyalists of the Carolinas to come in and take up arms for the crown. And this is where the war revealed its true and terrible nature. Because the fighting in the Carolina backcountry was not really a clean contest between two national armies. It was a civil war. Neighbor against neighbor. A brutal, close, personal conflict in which patriot and loyalist militias burned each other's farms and settled old scores under the cover of a larger cause. The event that broke the back of loyalist recruitment in the region was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was an ambush built entirely on deception, and it happened on the 25th of February, 1781. American cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Lee. Light Horse Harry Lee, whose son Robert would command another army in another war 80 years later, was operating in the area alongside militia under Andrew Pickens. Lee's legion wore green coats, so, as it happened, did Tarleton's British legion. And into this coincidence rode Colonel John Pyle, leading somewhere near 400 Loyalists who were marching to join Cornwallis and who expected that day to link up with Tarleton. When Pyle's column encountered Lee's green-coated horsemen on the road, the Loyalists assumed they had found the very British cavalry they were looking for. Lee, grasping the situation instantly, played the part. He rode down the length of the Loyalist line as though reviewing friendly troops, and by some accounts rode right up to Pyle himself and shook the man's hand, Pyle believing to the last that he was greeting a king's officer. It was a cold, audacious piece of theater. And then it fell apart. Toward the rear of the column, some of the Loyalists caught sight of Patriot militia among the trees and understood, too late, what was happening. Someone opened fire. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter over almost as soon as it began. The Loyalists had their rifles slung across their backs, useless, because they had believed themselves among friends. Lee's cavalry, already in among them, went to work with the saber at close quarters. In something like 10 minutes, roughly 90 to 100 Loyalists were cut down, many of them never having fired a shot or understood who was killing them. It was grim, and it was ugly, and its effect was exactly as decisive as a major victory. Word of Pyle's defeat, Pyle's massacre as many called it, raced through the countryside, and the message it carried was unmistakable. Come out for the king, and this is what waits for you on the road. The Loyalist rising that the entire Southern strategy depended upon quietly died. Men who might have joined Cornwallis stayed home. The general was raising an army of ghosts. It's worth sitting for a moment with what Pyle's defeat really tells us, because it exposes the thing the British High Command never fully understood about the war they were fighting in the South. London imagined a clean contest, the king's regulars restoring order, a loyal population welcoming them, rebellion melting away in the face of legitimate authority. What was actually happening on the ground was a civil war, and one of the most vicious kinds. Neighbor against neighbor, farm against farm. A landscape of ambushes and reprisals and old grudges settled under the banner of a larger cause. The Southern strategy depended entirely on the Loyalists being willing and able to come out and fight. But every Pyle's defeat, every massacre on a back road, every burned homestead taught the fence-sitters and the reluctant that declaring for the king was a fast way to die. And that the British Army, which might march through your county in the spring and be 100 miles away by summer, could not actually protect the people who rose for it. That was the rot at the center of Cornwallis's entire position, and it had nothing to do with battlefield tactics. He could win every stand-up fight in the Carolinas and still be losing, because the political foundation the whole campaign rested on was crumbling underneath him. An army that cannot feed itself from a hostile countryside, cannot recruit from a terrorized population, and cannot hold ground it has bled to take, is not an army that is winning, no matter what the maps say. Greene understood this in his bones. It was why he was content to lose battles. He wasn't fighting for the ground. He was fighting for time and for the slow certainty that a British army stranded in a country that would not sustain it would eventually wear away to nothing. Guilford Courthouse was simply the place where he decided to hand that process one hard, deliberate shove. Through the first weeks of March, the campaign settled into a tense, probing dance. Greene, reinforced and resupplied in Virginia, recrossed the Dan back into North Carolina. But he was not yet ready to fight. He sent his light troops forward under Colonel Otho Holland Williams to screen his movements, harass the British, and keep Cornwallis guessing. A running series of skirmishes and rearguard actions, including a sharp little fight at Wetzel's Mill, all designed to obscure where the main American army actually was and what it intended to do. But Greene was watching and waiting and counting. He was watching Cornwallis's army grow hungrier and thinner and more isolated with every passing day in a countryside that would not feed it and a population that would not rise for it. He was waiting for the moment when his own force was strongest and his enemy's was weakest. And he was counting reinforcements, fresh Virginia and North Carolina militia coming in, new Continentals arriving, until, by the middle of March, he commanded something like 4,400 men. Against Cornwallis's roughly 2,000, that was better than a 2-to-1 advantage. For a general whose entire philosophy was to avoid battle until the odds tilted his way, this was the moment. The British were starved and exhausted, worn down by weeks of fruitless marching, cut off from supply, denied their loyalist rising. Greene's own force was as large and as rested as it was ever likely to be. So Greene did something that, after months of relentless retreat, must have startled his enemy. He stopped running, he turned around, and he offered battle. On a piece of ground he had personally scouted weeks earlier and chosen with great care. A small backcountry crossroads, a scatter of buildings around a courthouse, set among dense woods and muddy little fields. Guilford Courthouse. Before the two armies collide, it's worth pausing on the men whose choices, in the space of 2 hours, would settle the fate of the American South. Because Guilford was a battle decided less by grand strategy than by a handful of individuals doing violent, split-second things in the smoke. And understanding who they were makes the chaos that follows legible. Start with the two commanders, because they were near opposites in almost every way. Nathaniel Greene, we have already met, the limping Quaker foundry owner, cast out of his faith, self-taught in war, cool and patient and relentlessly intelligent. A man whose great gift was the ability to lose a battle and win a campaign. He did not crave the decisive stroke. He craved the outcome, and he was willing to be beaten a dozen times to get it. Across from him stood Charles, Lord Cornwallis, an aristocrat by birth, a professional soldier by temperament, and by instinct, everything Greene was not. Cornwallis believed in the decisive blow. He believed in shock, in discipline, in the naked terror of trained infantry advancing behind a hedge of bayonets. And he believed, with real justification given his record, that British steel could overcome almost any disadvantage in numbers. He was brave to the point of recklessness. He would spend this battle riding directly into the worst of the fighting, and he would have more than one horse shot out from under him doing it. His flaw was not cowardice or incompetence. His flaw was that his greatest strength, that hunger for the decisive engagement, was the exact thing Greene had spent 3 months learning to weaponize against him. Then there were the officers who would actually execute the killing. Colonel Otho Holland Williams, born to tenant farmers in Maryland and orphaned young, had come up the hard way. Apprenticed as a clerk, captured early in the war at Fort Washington, imprisoned in New York, exchanged, and returned to the Army as one of its most meticulous and capable tactical commanders. At Guilford, he led Greene's light infantry and the Maryland Brigade, the professional corps of the whole Army. Under Williams served Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard, the same John Eager Howard who had turned the tide at Cowpens with an unhesitating bayonet charge. Born to Maryland privilege, a veteran of White Plains and Germantown and Monmouth, Howard was a study in contradiction, reserved, quiet, almost placid off the battlefield, and utterly ruthless on it. He was also touchy about his honor to a degree that occasionally spilled into violence. At one winter camp, he'd gotten into a physical brawl with an artillery officer serious enough to trigger a court-martial, from which Washington himself ultimately acquitted him. At Cowpens, he had been the calm hand that halted a stumbling line and turned it into a killing machine. At Guilford, he would have to do it again, under worse conditions. At the exact instant, everything was falling apart. And there was Lieutenant Colonel William Washington, a second cousin of the Commander-in-Chief, leading the 3rd Continental Light Dragoons. Washington had won fame at Cowpens for smashing Tarleton's flank, and he led the way cavalry leaders of that age often did. From the front, sword out, exposing himself to as much danger as any trooper he commanded. His charge would become the beating heart of the climax at Guilford, and it would nearly kill him. Finally, there was a man who belongs less to military history than to legend, though he was entirely real. Peter Francisco, the Virginia giant. His origins are a genuine mystery. He had been found abandoned as a small boy on a Virginia dock, speaking only Portuguese, his true name and homeland lost. Most likely, we now think, an immigrant from the Portuguese Azores who came ashore around 1765. Apprenticed to a blacksmith because of his sheer size, he grew into a physical marvel of the 18th century. By the accounts, roughly 6 feet 6 inches tall and around 260 pounds. In an era when the average soldier stood well under 5.5 feet, stories clung to him the way they cling to few real men, and we will treat them carefully when we reach them. Because the gap between what Francisco himself claimed and what later generations said he did is one of the more revealing things about how war makes legends. But he was on that field, and he fought there and bled there, and what happened around him became one of the strangest episodes of the entire revolution. These were the men, now the ground. The 15th of March, 1781, dawned clear and bitterly cold. A light frost lay on the ground and burned off slowly as the sun came up. But underneath it, the earth stayed soft and heavy and wet, saturated by a long winter of rain and snow, the kind of spongy, sucking ground that pulls at boots and slows an advance to a crawl. That mud would matter in a battle where one side depended on the speed and momentum of a disciplined charge. The ground itself was quietly on the other side. The battlefield was not a clean, open plain of the sort European commanders were trained to fight on. It was a mosaic, patches of muddy farm clearing belonging to a family named Hoskins, stitched together by dense, old-growth oak forest, thick with underbrush. A road, the Great Salisbury Road, ran west to east through the middle of it, climbing a gentle, undulating slope for something close to half a mile up toward the courthouse at the top. Greene had walked this ground weeks before and understood exactly what it would do. Those dense woods were poison to British tactical doctrine. The whole terrifying power of 18th century British infantry lay in the disciplined line. Hundreds of men moving as one body, delivering synchronized volleys, then advancing behind a solid, unbroken wall of bayonets. That system required open ground and clear sight lines. It fell apart in a forest. Among the trees and the tangled brush, the neat lines would snag and fracture into knots of individuals. The volleys would lose their crushing unity. And the bayonet, the psychological weapon that broke militia before it ever touched them, would find its work half undone by tree trunks and briars. Greene had chosen ground that would take his enemy's greatest strength and quietly unstring it. He was doing with the Carolina forest something like what other great defensive commanders did with trenches and hills, reshaping the battlefield until the enemy's advantages stopped counting. Now Greene arranged his 4,400 men, and here the memory of Cowpens is written all over the design. Like Morgan, he built a defense in depth. 3 separate lines, stacked one behind another up the slope, each intended to bleed the British before falling back and passing the enemy on to the next. The first line, at the bottom of the slope behind a split rail fence at the edge of a muddy clearing, was about 1,000 North Carolina militia. These were the least reliable troops on the field, and Greene knew it. And so, exactly as Morgan had done, he asked them for almost nothing. Just 2 volleys. 2 good, aimed volleys into the advancing British, and then they had leave to fall back. On the flanks of this first line, tucked into the woods where they could pour fire down the length of the British formations as they advanced, he placed his hardest, most dangerous men, riflemen and cavalry, with William Washington's horse anchoring one flank and Henry Lee's legion the other, and companies of Virginia riflemen among them. The second line, roughly 350 yards back and set deep in the dense timber, was about 1,200 Virginia militia. These were a step up in quality from the North Carolinians. Many were seasoned frontiersmen, some were veterans of earlier campaigns, and crucially, they would be fighting from cover, shielded by the heavy woods. And the third line, another 550 yards farther back on a rising knoll near the courthouse itself, was the anvil. Around 1,400 Continental regulars from Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia. These were Greene's professionals, the men he had kept alive through the whole long retreat. And this was where he expected the battle to be decided. But look closely at those distances, because they contain the flaw that would nearly undo the entire American army. Greene had spaced his 3 lines far apart, 350 yards to the second, another 550 to the third. At Cowpens, Morgan's lines had been close enough to support one another, close enough that the retreat of one blended into the strength of the next in a single continuous action. Greene's lines were too far apart for that. Each would essentially fight its own separate, isolated battle, unable to see or support the others through the intervening woods. It made the defense deep, but it also made it disjointed. When the crisis came at the third line, the men there would face it alone, with no one behind them and no way to know what was happening 2 fields away. Historians have debated Greene's spacing ever since. It may have been deliberate, a way to keep the militia's inevitable panic from infecting the regulars. It may have been a genuine compromise forced by the ground. Either way, it built a structural fragility into the American position that the British, for one shining hour, came very close to exploiting all the way to victory. Cornwallis, for his part, arranged his roughly 2,000 veterans for exactly the kind of fight he wanted. On his left, Lieutenant Colonel James Webster commanded a hard-hitting wing built around the 33rd Regiment of Foot, the 23rd Royal Welch Fusiliers, and the Jaegers, German riflemen. On his right, Major General Alexander Leslie led the 71st Highlanders and the Hessian Regiment von Boos. In the center and reserve stood the elite of the whole army: the 2nd Battalion of Guards, the Grenadiers, and the Guards Light Infantry, under Brigadier General Charles O'Hara and Lieutenant Colonel James Stewart. And behind it all waited what was left of Tarleton's British Legion cavalry, held back for the decisive moment. 3 light 3-pounder cannon under Lieutenant John McLeod rounded out the force. Small guns. But they would fire the most infamous shots of the day. 2 armies. One outnumbered better than 2 to 1, but veteran, disciplined, and desperate. The other, larger but brittle, layered in depth across ground designed to break the very tactics the enemy lived by. In the early afternoon, the British came up the Salisbury Road and the killing began. Before the shooting starts, it's worth naming what Greene had actually built here, because it's easy to look at 3 lines of men and see only 3 chances to lose. That's not what it was. It was a machine for trading space and time against the one resource the British could never get more of. Think about what a single defensive line does against a determined attacker. It fights, it inflicts some casualties, and eventually it either holds or it breaks. One roll of the dice, one exchange, and then a result. Now stack 3 of them, one behind the other, and something changes. The attacker doesn't get one fight. He gets 3 in sequence, and he has to win all of them. He has to cross the killing ground of the first line, absorb its fire, break it, and then, already thinned, already tired, already bleeding, do the whole thing again against the second, and then a third time against the third. Each line is a filter. Each one takes something off the top of the attacking force and passes a weaker, more exhausted version of it along to the next. That is defense in depth. And it is one of the oldest and most reliable ideas in warfare, because it converts the defender's disadvantage in quality into an advantage in accumulation. You don't have to beat the enemy in any single exchange. You just have to make him pay at every one of them. And Greene had tuned each filter to the men manning it. He didn't ask the shaky North Carolina militia to hold. He asked them for 2 volleys and gave them permission to run so that their inevitable flight became part of the plan instead of a catastrophe. He put the steadier Virginia militia in the deep woods where cover would let ordinary men stand longer than they otherwise could. And he saved his professionals for last, fresh on the high ground, for the moment when the British would arrive spent and broken. Every line was asked for exactly what it was capable of giving, and no more. That is the difference between a general who despises his militia for running and a general who builds his battle around the fact that they will. Morgan had proven the idea worked at Cowpens. Greene was betting the American South that it would scale. There was only one crack in the design, and we've already named it. The lines were too far apart to help one another. But on the whole, what waited on that slope was not 3 chances to lose. It was a gauntlet, and the British were about to run every step of it. The battle opened, as so many did, with the guns. In the early afternoon, Cornwallis brought McLeod's little 3-pounders forward and opened fire on the American center. And the American artillery, Captain Anthony Singleton's heavier 6-pounders, answered. For perhaps half an hour, the 2 sides simply dueled with cannon across the muddy clearing, a grim overture. The sources preserve one horrific image from those minutes. A solid iron ball that struck an American soldier on the line and tore the spine clean out of his body. That is what a cannonball does to a man. It is worth holding on to, because the numbers we will talk about later, the percentages, the casualty rates, are all made of moments exactly like that one, multiplied by the hundreds. Then Greene pulled his guns back, and the British infantry started forward. Picture it from the American side, from behind that split-rail fence. Across the open, muddy field, a long line of British and German regulars comes on at a deliberate, measured pace. Their equipment heavy, their boots dragging in the saturated ground, their formation dressed and steady despite it all. There is something genuinely terrifying about disciplined infantry advancing slowly and without hurry, because the slowness is a kind of message. We are not afraid of you, and we are coming anyway. Greene rode along behind the North Carolina militia as they watched this apparition approach, and he called out to them the only thing he was asking. 3 rounds, my boys, and then you may fall back. Just 3, then you can go. At 150 yards, the militia fired their first volley. The effect was staggering. These were backcountry men with long rifles and muskets. many of them hunters who had been putting food on the table with a single aimed shot their whole lives. And at that range, into a packed formation, they could hardly miss. The volley tore through the British line and opened great ragged holes in it. An American who watched it left behind an image that has outlived everyone who stood on that field. The British ranks, he said, went down like stalks of wheat before the harvester's blade. Whole sections simply dropped. And here is the thing that tells you everything about the army Cornwallis commanded. The British closed the gaps. They stepped over their own dead and dying, dressed their ranks back into a solid line, and kept coming. There was no faltering, no hesitation, just that same measured, inexorable advance, now over the bodies of their friends. At 50 yards they halted, leveled their muskets, and fired one crushing synchronized volley of their own. Then they cheered, dropped their bayonets to the charge, and came on at the run. For the militia behind the fence, that was the end. It is one thing to fire a rifle at a distant line. It is another to watch a wall of screaming men with 18 inches of sharpened steel on the ends of their muskets come sprinting straight at you. And to know that you have no bayonet of your own, no way to meet that steel, nothing to do but stab back and die or run. Some of the North Carolinians managed a second volley. Then the center of the line dissolved. Men threw down their loaded weapons, abandoned their gear, and fled into the woods behind them, and no power on earth was going to stop them. Greene had asked for 3 volleys and gotten roughly 2, which, given who these men were and what they were facing, was close to a small miracle, and cost the British dearly for the price of a line that was always going to break. But on the flanks, in the woods, something very different was happening. There, Greene's hidden riflemen and cavalry poured a galling, murderous fire into the sides of the advancing British, and the British had to turn and deal with them. On the southern flank especially, the Hessian von Boos regiment and a battalion of guards found themselves dragged sideways into the forest, into a vicious, sprawling, private little war against Lee's Legion and Campbell's riflemen. A fight that pulled them deeper and deeper into the trees and, crucially, out of the main battle entirely. For the rest of the afternoon, some of Cornwallis's best troops would be lost in the woods to the south, fighting an enemy that kept giving ground and drawing them further from the decisive point. The first line had broken in the center, but it had done its work. It had bloodied the British badly and begun the process of peeling the attacking force apart. Now the British pressed on up the slope and into the deep timber, and the battle changed character entirely. Whatever cohesion the attacking formations had managed to keep across the open field, the forest took away. This was old-growth woodland, thick with underbrush, and there is simply no way to keep a proper linear formation intact while forcing it through trees and brambles. The neat lines came apart into clumps and knots of men, and the disciplined, controlled advance degenerated into exactly the kind of fighting the British were worst suited for. Scattered, point-blank, tree-to-tree combat where every man was half on his own, and the great machine of the British line counted for almost nothing. Waiting for them here were the Virginia militia of Greene's second line, and these were not the North Carolinians. They were shielded by heavy timber. Many of them were hard frontiersmen or veterans, and they knew how to fight from cover, how to load behind a tree trunk, lean out, pick a target, fire, and slip back. The result was a savage, grinding, close-range firefight in the gloom of the forest. Muzzle flashes and powder smoke and men falling on both sides. The British bayonet, so decisive in the open, was largely useless here. You cannot deliver a massed bayonet charge through a thicket. Their single greatest advantage had been neutralized by the ground, exactly as Greene had planned when he chose it. The fighting in those woods was some of the most brutal of the entire war, and it fell especially hard on the British officers. The Virginia riflemen, aiming deliberately, cut down officer after officer. The men in the finer coats, the ones giving orders, the irreplaceable core of a professional army's leadership. Cornwallis, unable to see or control his fragmenting advance from behind, did the thing that defined him. He rode directly into the chaos to rally his men in person, right into the heart of the firefight. It nearly killed him. He had more than one horse shot out from under him in the course of the battle, and there is a story, impossible now to fully confirm, that at one point he was riding a dragoon's horse with the dead dragoon's blood still on the saddle, having lost his own mounts. This was a commander spending his own life freely to hold his attack together, and it tells you how close to collapse that attack had come. The Virginians held for a long time, but they could not hold forever. They began to run low on ammunition and on flints, the small, unglamorous limits that decide real battles. And when one of their commanders, Brigadier General Edward Stevens, was shot through the thigh, the rigidity of the line began to go. Unable to sustain the fight indefinitely against the relentless British pressure, the Virginia militia did what Greene's whole design permitted them to do. They conducted a fighting withdrawal, giving ground grudgingly, still shooting, and fell back. And in falling back, they uncovered the last line. The British, bloodied, exhausted, scattered, their officer corps savaged, their formations in tatters, some of their best units still lost in the woods to the south, pushed on through the trees toward the top of the slope, toward Greene's Continentals, toward the courthouse, toward the climax. It's worth stopping here, in the woods, before the final act, because this middle phase is the part of Guilford that the tidy summaries skip, and it's where a great deal of the actual dying happened. We talk about battles in clean geometric terms, lines and wings and flanks and phases. But strip that away and picture what the second line really was. It was hours of men killing each other at conversational distance in a dark, smoke-choked forest, so close that they could sometimes see each other's faces before they fired. A Virginia farmer crouched behind an oak, hands shaking as he bit a cartridge, trying to reload before the man he'd just missed reloaded first. A young British regular stepping over a friend who was screaming and would not stop, pushing forward because stopping was somehow worse. There was no glory in that woodland fight, and very little that anyone could see or control. There was just the powder smoke and the tree bark exploding, and the terrible intimacy of it. And this is where the arithmetic Greene was building became something more than a metaphor, because the men falling here were not interchangeable. Every British officer that a Virginia rifleman took out of the fight in these woods was a small, permanent wound to the army as a whole. A sergeant's worth of experience, a lieutenant's worth of steadiness, gone and not coming back across 3,000 miles of ocean. The riflemen knew it. They aimed for the coats with the finest cut, the men on horseback, the ones giving orders. It was ruthless, and it was precisely the point. Greene's whole war was a campaign to inflict casualties the enemy couldn't replace. And nowhere on the field did that campaign do more quiet, decisive work than in the gloom of these trees. One aimed shot at a time. By the time the British finally clawed their way out of the woods and up toward the courthouse, they had won the ground twice over and paid for it with exactly the men they could least afford to lose. The British troops who finally staggered out of the tree line into the clearing near the courthouse were not the same army that had marched up the Salisbury Road 2 hours before. They were fragmented. They were exhausted, having fought their way through a mile of forest and 2 defensive lines. They were bleeding, badly, everywhere, especially among the officers. And they emerged not as a coordinated army, but in pieces, unit by unit, as each fought its way clear of the woods at a slightly different moment. Waiting for them, up a gentle slope of some 550 yards, was the one thing they had not yet faced all day. Fresh, disciplined, professional troops who had not fired a shot. 1,400 Continental regulars of the Third Line, Maryland and Delaware and Virginia, standing steady on the rising ground. This was the fight Greene had been building toward through 3 months of retreat and 2 hours of bloodletting. The first British unit to break out of the trees was Webster's wing on the British left, and its commander made a fateful decision. Lieutenant Colonel James Webster was aggressive to his bones, and rather than wait for the rest of the shattered army to come up and deploy alongside him, he simply attacked, flinging his men, the 33rd Foot and the Guards Light Infantry and the Jaegers, straight up the slope at the American right, where the veteran 1st Maryland and Kirkwood's tough Delaware Continentals and Virginia riflemen stood waiting. It was courage, and it was a catastrophe. The Continentals held their fire with iron discipline, letting the British come on up the open ground, closer and closer, until they were within 100 feet. Then they fired. A single, full, synchronized volley at murderously close range, straight into the charging ranks, and it shattered them. The 33rd Foot was torn apart. Webster himself went down with a musket ball through the knee, a wound that would kill him not long after, and his broken command reeled back down the slope and tumbled into a ravine to try to regroup. The first British lunge at the Third Line had been thrown back with terrible loss. For a moment, standing on that knoll, the Americans held a complete and decisive victory in their hands. And then the center of the British Army arrived, and everything began to go wrong at once. Out of the woods came the elite of Cornwallis's army, the 2nd Battalion of Guards and the Grenadiers, the household troops, the most disciplined and prestigious infantry on the field. They were led out by Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, the same O'Hara who had crossed the freezing Catawba on a grenadier's back. And O'Hara led them out of the trees, already dying on his feet, shot through the chest and bleeding heavily. Unable to keep command, he handed the battalion over to Lieutenant Colonel James Stewart, and Stewart, taking one look at the American line above him, saw exactly the weakness he needed. Not every regiment in Greene's Third Line was equal. The 1st Maryland, on the American right, was a veteran unit, hard, experienced, the men who had just annihilated Webster's charge. But beside them stood the 2nd Maryland, and the 2nd Maryland was Greene. It was a freshly raised regiment, far less seasoned, and at that moment it was tangled in a confusion of orders, uncertain and unsteady in a way that veteran troops are not. Stewart's eye found them. He wheeled the 2nd Guards toward the 2nd Maryland and sent his household troops forward with the bayonet. The Greene Regiment did not hold. As that wall of elite British infantry came at them with leveled steel, the 2nd Maryland broke and fled, giving way before the Guards even reached them, leaving a gaping hole torn straight through the center of the American line. And the Guards surged into it. They came pouring through the gap, and as they did, they overran and captured 2 of the American 6-pounder cannon that had been posted in the center. In an instant, the whole battle had turned upside down. Webster's charge had failed on the right, but here, in the center, the finest troops in Cornwallis's army had ruptured Greene's line and were flooding into the American rear. The third line, the anvil, the last line, the position Greene had built his entire campaign to reach, was breaking. The battle was balanced in that moment, on the edge of total American collapse. Everything now depended on the next 60 seconds, and on a handful of men deciding, without orders and without time to think, to do something about it. The man who moved first was John Eager Howard. And it is worth appreciating that this is the second time in 2 months, at 2 different battles, that the fate of an American army came to rest on the calm of this one reserved, honor-touchy Marylander at the precise moment of maximum chaos. The 1st Maryland stood next to the hole the 2nd Maryland had just left. Its commander, Colonel John Gunby, saw the danger and ordered the regiment to wheel left, to turn and face the exposed flank of the Guards pouring through the gap. And in the middle of that maneuver, Gunby's horse was shot and fell, pinning the colonel to the ground beneath it. Command dropped in a heartbeat to his deputy, to Howard. Howard did at Guilford what he had done at Cowpens. He did not flinch, and he did not hurry. He brought the wheeling regiment around, faced it toward the Guards, and held his men's fire until the range was point blank, and then unleashed a full volley directly into the flank of the British household troops. The fire tore into them and stopped their momentum cold. And then Howard drew his sword and bellowed the order that had won the day at Cowpens: the bayonet. The blue-coated Maryland Continentals lowered their steel and charged into the disordered Guards. And 2 of the best infantry units on the field crashed together in a savage, close-quarters killing match, bayonet against bayonet, in the churned mud near the captured guns. And at that exact instant, from his position in reserve, William Washington saw the whole thing. Saw the Guards exposed, saw the Marylanders closing, saw the opening. He didn't wait for orders. He put himself at the head of the 3rd Continental Light Dragoons, sounded the charge, and led them at a full gallop down the slope into the flank and rear of the British Guards. There is nothing on an 18th century battlefield quite as devastating as heavy cavalry hitting infantry that is already locked in a fight and can't form to receive it. Infantry could defend against horsemen, but only by forming a tight, bristling square or a solid line of leveled bayonets, and only if they saw the charge coming with time to prepare. The Guards had neither. They were disordered, strung out, tangled hand-to-hand with Howard's Marylanders, their attention fixed entirely on the enemy in front of them. And into their flank and rear came Washington's dragoons at a gallop, a wall of horseflesh and sabers. The impact was catastrophic. Washington's cavalry tore clean through the mass of the 2nd Guards, sabering men as they went, then wheeled their horses around and drove back through a second time, cutting, trampling, breaking apart what little order remained. Caught between Howard's bayonets and Washington's sabers, the Guards came apart. What had been, moments before, a triumphant elite battalion flooding through a broken enemy line was now a knot of desperate men being surrounded and cut down in the mud. The household troops of the British Army being torn to pieces in the center of the field. It is here, in this swirling chaos, that some of the most dramatic and most disputed moments of the whole battle are said to have happened. And this is exactly the point where a careful account has to slow down and separate what we know from what legend later added. Take the death of Lieutenant Colonel James Stewart, the Guards commander who had spotted the gap and led his men into it. By the traditional account, Stewart found himself in a personal fight with an American officer, Captain John Smith of the 1st Maryland. 2 commanders trying to kill each other by hand in the middle of a collapsing battle. What exactly finished Stewart is genuinely uncertain. Some accounts have Smith cutting him down with a heavy saber. Others say he was shot by a musket ball fired from the Maryland ranks as the 2 men fought. Either way, the man who had come within a whisker of winning the battle for Cornwallis died in the wreck of the attack he had launched. And the manner of his death passed straight into the folklore of the battlefield. And then there is Peter Francisco, the Virginia giant, whose exploits in this melee are the most famous thing about him, and the hardest to pin down. The story that has come down through 19th century biographies and the inscription later carved on his battlefield monument is spectacular. That Francisco, swinging an enormous broadsword, cut down 11 British guardsmen in succession. That when a soldier pinned his leg to his horse with a bayonet, the giant split the man's skull to the shoulder and fought on. It is a magnificent story. It is also almost certainly bigger than the truth. Because Francisco himself, in the pension applications he filed decades later, made a far more modest claim, that he was seen to kill 2 men and struck other blows that may well have been fatal to more. In a later application, he raised the count to 4. The figure of 11 and the head cleaving and the notion that he personally led Washington's charge all come not from Francisco, but from the legend that grew up around him after the fact. What we can say with confidence is the sober part. That Peter Francisco was really there, that he fought with conspicuous courage, and that he took a serious bayonet wound to the leg that would trouble him for the rest of his life. The rest is the way a genuinely extraordinary man becomes a genuinely extraordinary tall tale. And it's worth telling honestly, because the honest version is remarkable enough. William Washington nearly died in the same minutes. His horse was shot beneath him and collapsed, pinning the cavalry commander to the mud, and he had to be pulled free by his own troopers before an enemy could finish him. This was the leading from the front that made him beloved and made him vulnerable. And it very nearly ended him on the same charge that made him famous. The elite 2nd Battalion of Guards, the pride of the British Army in the South, was being annihilated. In another minute or two, it would have been destroyed outright, and with it, the center of Cornwallis's army. And if the British center collapsed, the whole force might follow. And Greene would win not just the field, but total war-ending victory in the South. Everyone who could see the melee understood it, including Cornwallis, watching from the edge of the woods, his household troops dying in front of him, with no reserve close enough to save them. What Cornwallis did next is the single act for which this battle is best remembered, and it is worth slowing down to understand exactly what it was and exactly what it cost, because it is the whole meaning of Guilford compressed into one order. Cornwallis rode to Lieutenant John McLeod, whose 3-pounder guns sat on a rise along the Salisbury Road, looking down at the writhing mass where guardsmen and Marylanders and dragoons were tangled together in mortal combat. And he ordered McLeod to load the guns with grape shot, canvas bags packed with iron balls that turn a cannon into an enormous shotgun, spraying death in a widening cone, and to fire directly into the melee, into the churning knot of men where his own elite guards were fighting for their lives, inseparably mixed with the enemy. He could not clear the Americans off his guards without also cutting down the guards themselves. He gave the order anyway. O'Hara, bleeding, we should remember, from the chest wound that would nearly kill him, begged Cornwallis to hold the order. Those were his men down there, his household troops, and the grape shot would kill them along with the Americans. And Cornwallis refused. The line the tradition preserves is chillingly composed. "It is a necessary evil," he is said to have answered, "which we must endure to avert impending destruction." A necessary evil. The general had done the arithmetic that Greene had been forcing on him for 3 months, and he had reached the only answer that saved his army. Better to lose part of the guards to his own guns than to lose the whole battalion, and then the battle, and then the war. McLeod's guns roared, and the grape shot ripped through the melee, through horse and dragoon and Continental and guardsman without distinction, mowing down friend and enemy together, clearing a bloody swath through the center of the fight. It was a horrifying thing to do to one's own men, and it worked. The shock of it stunned the American attackers, broke the momentum of the countercharge, and blasted the two armies apart. The surviving guardsmen, bloodied by their own artillery, managed to pull themselves out of the kill zone and stagger back to reform. The Marylanders fell back to their line. Washington's shattered dragoons disengaged. The gap in the American center that had promised total victory a minute before had been slammed shut. With iron, and with the bodies of the men who fired it, and the men it was fired upon alike. Cornwallis had saved his army. He had done it by turning his own cannon on his own finest troops. And in that single decision, you can see the entire tragedy of his campaign. To hold the field at Guilford Courthouse, he had been reduced to destroying the very thing that made his army worth having. Here is the part that's easy to get wrong about Cornwallis, and worth getting right, because the temptation is to read the grape shot as the act of a butcher or a blunderer, and he was neither. He was, by the standards of his profession and his age, an excellent general. His instincts were sound. His men trusted him. He led from the front and shared their danger, and had the horses shot out from under him to prove it. The decision to burn his baggage and chase Greene across North Carolina was aggressive to the edge of recklessness. But it very nearly worked. And a more timid commander would have let the Americans slip away untouched. The order to fire on his own guards was terrible and also correct. It saved his army, and hesitating would have lost it. At almost every decision point in this campaign, Cornwallis chose the bold, professional, defensible option. And it led him, step by careful step, to disaster. That is the deepest and most uncomfortable lesson of the whole story. And it has nothing to do with either general being a fool. Cornwallis lost because his greatest strengths, his aggression, his hunger for the decisive blow, his faith in the fighting quality of his men, were exactly the qualities Greene had learned to turn into a weapon. A cautious enemy Greene could not have trapped this way. A cautious enemy would never have burned his own supplies, never have chased a fleeing army to the point of exhaustion, never have hurled his troops up a slope into 3 lines of prepared defenders rather than wait and maneuver. It was Cornwallis's virtues, not his vices, that Greene played on. He took a good general's best instincts and arranged the board so that acting on them meant self-destruction. There's a hard truth in that for anyone who has ever confused being skilled with being safe. A capable opponent who understands you can make your competence itself the trap. With the melee blown apart and both armies reeling, Nathaniel Greene made the decision that his entire career had prepared him to make. The decision that a more romantic or more prideful general might have gotten wrong, and that a lesser one certainly would have. He looked at the field clearly. His 2nd Maryland had fled. His counterattack had been broken up by the grape shot. His guns in the center had been overrun. Cornwallis still had troops in hand that hadn't been committed. Tarleton's cavalry, the 71st Highlanders. And they were beginning to threaten the American left. And Greene understood, in that moment, that he stood 1 bad quarter hour away from turning a magnificent afternoon of bleeding the British white into a genuine disaster in which his own army might be trapped and destroyed. He had spent 3 months keeping this army alive precisely so that it could keep existing, keep threatening, keep forcing the British to spend men they couldn't replace. He was not going to throw it away now for the sake of a courthouse. So Greene broke off the battle. He ordered a general withdrawal, and the Continentals executed it the way disciplined troops do. In good order, covering their movement, pulling back to the north toward the troublesome ironworks, some miles away. It cost him something to leave, because the horses that pulled his 4 6-pounder cannon had been killed in the fighting. He had no way to move the guns, and had to abandon them on the field. To a certain kind of commander, losing your artillery is an unbearable disgrace. To Greene, it was arithmetic. Guns could be replaced. The army could not. He gave up the cannon and kept the thing that mattered and marched away with his force intact. Cornwallis held the ground. His men were far too exhausted, too depleted, too badly hurt to mount any real pursuit. They simply watched the Americans go, and then they sank down where they stood, the winners of the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, on a field they had bought at a price that would ruin them. If you want to understand what this victory actually cost the British, don't look first at the casualty tables. Look at the night that followed, because it may be the most quietly horrific part of the entire story. As the light failed, the weather broke, the temperature plunged, and a torrential, freezing rain swept across the wooded battlefield, hammering down on the living and the dead, and the hundreds of wounded men scattered for miles through the trees. And Cornwallis's army, the army that had burned its own baggage weeks earlier in the desperate chase across North Carolina, had almost nothing left to help them. Few tents, few medical supplies, little food. More than 400 wounded men lay out in the dark and the icy rain, British and German and American. And the victorious British Army could do almost nothing for them. Sergeant Roger Lamb, whose account has walked with us through this whole campaign, recorded the result. And it is a sentence to sit with. At least 50 wounded men died of exposure that night, in the freezing mud, before the sun came up. Not killed by the enemy, killed by cold and rain and the sheer inability of a victorious army to care for its own. That is what Cornwallis had won. A frozen field full of dying men he could not save, and a road that led, though he did not yet know it, straight to Yorktown. Now the numbers, because they are the whole point, and because Greene had spent 3 months turning this war into a subtraction problem the British could not solve. Cornwallis had brought roughly 2,100 men to Guilford. He lost something in the region of 530 of them, killed, wounded, and missing. A casualty rate around a quarter of his entire force in a single afternoon. And these were not replaceable men. They were veteran British and German regulars, 3,000 miles from home, at the end of a supply line that ran across an ocean. Every one of them who fell was gone for good, because there was no reservoir of trained regulars in the Carolinas to draw on. Worst of all, the losses fell brutally on the officers, the men in the fine coats the Virginia riflemen had picked off in the woods, the leaders a professional army cannot function without. Webster was dying, Stuart was dead, O'Hara was gravely wounded. Tarleton had lost fingers to a musket ball. The command structure of Cornwallis's army had been gutted. The American numbers look larger on paper, something like 1,300. But they tell a completely different and far less damaging story. The great majority of the American losses were North Carolina and Virginia militiamen listed as missing, and most of those men were not dead or captured at all. They had simply run when the lines broke and then kept going, walked off the field and gone home to their farms, as militia had done in every battle of the war. Greene's actual combat losses, among the Continentals who mattered to his fighting power, were low. He had bled the British badly and preserved his own real strength almost intact. When you strip away the militia who went home, the exchange rate at Guilford Courthouse was catastrophically lopsided in exactly the direction Greene needed. Which is why the most famous words spoken about this British victory were not spoken in triumph. When news of Guilford reached London, and word spread of what the battle had actually cost, the Whig politician Charles James Fox is said to have risen in Parliament and delivered the verdict that has clung to the battle ever since. Another such victory, he said, would ruin the British Army. It was not rhetoric. It was a precise description of the arithmetic. A few more wins like Guilford and Cornwallis would have no army left to win with. Greene's own assessment, written in the days after the battle, was blunter and even more clear-eyed about what had really happened. The enemy, he told Washington, had met with a defeat in a victory. Except for the ground itself and the abandoned guns, he wrote, they had gained no advantage at all. On the contrary, they were little short of being ruined. There is the whole philosophy in a handful of words. Cornwallis could keep the courthouse and the cornfield and the frozen mud. Greene was walking away with the thing that would win the war. The men, after victory and defeat, both immortalize the moment. They are far less kind to the men who lived through it, and the fates of the people who stood on that field scatter in every direction. Some into glory, some into obscurity, some into legend, and at least one into a grave marked generations later by his enemies. Nathanael Greene, the losing general who was winning the war, did exactly what his strategy demanded. He did not chase Cornwallis. He turned south instead, back into the Carolinas the British had supposedly conquered, and set about methodically prying loose the chain of isolated British outposts one by one. Hobkirk's Hill, 96, Eutaw Springs. He lost some of those fights too, in the narrow tactical sense. It didn't matter. He fought, got beat, rose, and fought again. And by the end of it, British control of the Deep South had simply evaporated, garrison by garrison, until almost nothing was left. Greene never won the kind of clean, decisive battlefield victory that makes a general's name ring down the centuries. He did something harder and rarer. He won a theater of war by losing battles intelligently, and he remains one of the most quietly brilliant soldiers the United States has ever produced. The general who proved that the army that survives is the army that wins. Charles, Lord Cornwallis, held the field at Guilford, and then found he could do nothing with it. His army was too broken to hold the interior of the Carolinas, too depleted to fight another battle like this one, surrounded by a countryside that fed him nothing and rose for him not at all. Within weeks, he marched what was left of his force to the coast at Wilmington to rest and resupply, and then, judging the Carolinas lost and looking for a decision somewhere else, he made the choice that ended everything. He marched north into Virginia, and in Virginia, 7 months after Guilford, he let himself be cornered on a peninsula at a place called Yorktown, pinned between Washington's army and Rochambeau's Frenchmen on land, and a French fleet at sea. And there, he surrendered his entire command. The road from the Carolina courthouse to the Virginia surrender is not a metaphor. It is a straight line, and by a small, bitter irony, it was the wounded Charles O'Hara, the general who had crossed the Catawba on a grenadier's back and begged Cornwallis not to fire the grape shot on his own guards, who rode out at Yorktown to offer the sword of surrender in his commander's place. James Webster, the aggressive colonel whose reckless charge shattered against the third line, died of the knee wound he took there. And Cornwallis is said to have mourned him deeply. James Stewart, who saw the gap and nearly won the battle, lay dead where he had fallen near the third line. Decades later, in 1866, a sword said to be his would be turned up out of the battlefield ground. And in the 1890s, a small marble monument would be raised near that spot. To this day, the only monument on the field dedicated to a British soldier. A modest stone acknowledgement, as its own inscription puts it, of a brave foe, and a quiet reminder that brave men die on the losing side of the arithmetic too. William Washington survived being pinned under his dying horse, went on fighting through the Southern campaign, and was eventually captured at Eutaw Springs later that same year, spending the rest of the war a prisoner. John Eager Howard, the reserved Marylander who twice in 2 months turned catastrophe into counterattack at the exact right instant, came through Guilford and went on to a long life and a distinguished career in the new republic he had helped to save. He is remembered, when he is remembered at all, as one of the finest combat officers of the Revolution, a man who was calmest precisely when everything was coming apart. And Peter Francisco, the abandoned Portuguese boy who became the Virginia giant, survived his wound and lived on for another half-century, his legend swelling with every retelling until it was impossible to say where the man ended and the myth began. He never rose to high rank. He didn't need to. He passed into American folklore instead, the strong man with a great sword, a figure so large in the imagination that the literal truth of him hardly matters anymore, which is its own kind of comment on how war remembers people. It preserves the commanders who kept making decisions and the individuals whose single afternoon was strange enough to become a story. The thousands of ordinary men who stood in those lines and fired those volleys and died in that freezing rain. The North Carolina farmer behind the split-rail fence, the Hessian conscript lost in the woods, the 50 wounded who froze to death in the mud before dawn. They become a number in a table, a percentage, the cost line in someone else's victory. Strip away the smoke and the sabers and the legend, and Guilford Courthouse endures because it is one of the clearest demonstrations in all of military history of a truth that arrogant powers keep having to relearn, that holding the field is not the same as winning the war, and that the side which wins the ground can be the side that loses everything. The first lesson is the one Greene built his whole campaign on. Battles are events. Wars are processes. A commander who thinks in single decisive engagements can be defeated by a commander who thinks in campaigns, who is willing to lose the event again and again in service of the process. Greene was beaten at Guilford in the narrowest sense. He left the field. He was winning the entire time because every apparent defeat cost his enemy more than it cost him. And he had the patience and the humility to keep taking those trades until they added up to a conquered enemy. Fight, get beat, rise, fight again. It is not a glamorous doctrine. It is a nearly unbeatable one in the hands of someone with the nerve to see it through. The second lesson is about terrain. And it is as old as war and as current as anything happening in the world today. Greene could not match Cornwallis's discipline in the open, so he refused to fight in the open. He chose ground, muddy fields, and dense forest that took the enemy's greatest strength, the disciplined bayonet line, and unstrung it thread by thread. The specific weapons are museum pieces now. The principle is permanent. A weaker force that controls where and how the fighting happens can neutralize a stronger one that doesn't. Armies with every material advantage have founded on exactly this, again and again, in jungles and mountains and cities in wars centuries later, whenever they let a patient enemy choose the battlefield. The third lesson lives in that single, awful order to fire the grape shot. It is the perfect image of a pyrrhic victory, a triumph that consumes the thing it was meant to preserve. Cornwallis did the right thing tactically. Firing saved his army in the moment. And it was also the exact moment his campaign died, because a general who has to destroy his own elite to survive an afternoon has already lost the larger contest, whatever the field returns say. Whenever the price of winning is the capacity to win again, the victory is an illusion. Guilford is what that illusion looks like when you watch it happen in real time. And the fourth lesson is about the men in the fine coats. The officer corps, the Virginia riflemen, deliberately shot to pieces in the woods. An army is not just a mass of muskets. It is a structure, and the structure runs on experience and leadership that takes years to build and minutes to destroy. Cornwallis's regulars were as good as any in the world. But you cannot conjure new Websters and Stewarts out of a stripped Carolina countryside 3,000 miles from home. The most dangerous casualties are the ones you can't replace, and Greene's whole strategy was aimed at inflicting exactly those. Every officer down in those woods was a permanent subtraction from a finite total. The British could win the field and still be losing the only race that counted, the race against their own exhaustion. Put those four together and you have the reason a small crossroads in the North Carolina backcountry decided the fate of a continent. Not because the Americans won there, they didn't, but because Nathaniel Greene understood, more deeply than almost any commander of his age, that the object of war is not to hold the ground where the fighting stopped. It is to still have an army when the fighting is over. The place is quiet now. Guilford Courthouse is preserved as a national military park, a stretch of restored woodland and open ground, with monuments standing among the trees where the lines once were. There is the Cavalry Monument, honoring William Washington's charge and the legend of Peter Francisco. There is the lone marble stone raised over the spot where James Stewart's sword came up out of the earth. Visitors walk the trails where the North Carolina militia fired their 2 volleys and ran, where the Virginia riflemen made their stand tree to tree, where the guards broke through and the dragoons came down the slope and the grape shot cleared the field. The mud has long since hardened. The forest has grown back. Nothing about the peaceful ground tells you what it cost. But the arithmetic Greene wrote there did not stay on that field. It walked north with a broken British army to Wilmington, and then to Virginia, and then to a peninsula called Yorktown, where the greatest army in the world laid down its weapons because it had won one victory too many. Cornwallis had chased his enemy across 2 states and beaten him in every race and held the ground at the end of the hardest fight of the campaign. And it destroyed him. He had spent his men to win a field, and the man who lost the field kept his army. And in this war, the army was everything. Sometimes the winner is simply the one who can afford the win. Nathaniel Greene understood that before he ever reached Guilford Courthouse, understood that a battle is only a number in a longer sum, and that you can lose every line of the equation and still be the one who writes the total. Cornwallis learned it slowly, over 3 exhausting months and 1 freezing, bloody afternoon. And then he learned it completely in a Virginia field 7 months later, with his sword held out in another man's hand. The enemy had the ground. Greene kept the army. And in the end, the army had the war.